I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to discuss the rise of the second party system and how the forces opposed to Andrew Jackson eventually coalesced into a national party, giving us our second of two political parties, the Whigs, to challenge Jackson's Democrats. So let's tell that story today. So today, here's our objectives. Take a moment to take them in, and we'll dive into our narrative. So the Whig Party is a party that's on the one hand, sort of, following the ideals of Henry Clay, as you can see here, and also is some degree, Jackson opposition forces, former Federalists, and people who are upset about Jackson's rise to power. The name Whig Party comes from the English Whigs, which were an anti-monarchy party, sort of styled that way in order to talk about opposing the quote-unquote monarchy of Andrew Jackson that we see here in this famous cartoon, King Andrew I, that we talked about previously. And it's partially, a political economic party, trying to unify the North and the West again in that same sort of coalition that ruled through the era of good feelings. So the Whig Party, in the election of 1836, Jackson is not going to run for a third term because of Washington's two presidential term precedents. The Democrats are going to choose Martin Van Buren, who's Jackson's handpicked successor, and hopefully Van Buren will be able to ride Jackson's popularity to the White House. And so here we see Martin Van Buren being literally carried to the White House by Andrew Jackson, which, fair. The Whigs, in order to try to defeat him, instead of going with a national strategy, because they don't yet have the ability to run a national candidate, or they don't feel like they have a national candidate, Henry Clay and the Whigs are going to instead run a series of regional candidates, with the basic goal being divide the electorate, throw the election into the House of Representatives, and then choose whichever one of the most popular of those candidates were to be president. So it's basically going for the same strategy of 1824, with then Henry Clay directing events in the House of Representatives to get a Whig candidate elected instead of Van Buren. So here we see all the Whig candidates trying to race against the hero of New Orleans and the little magician, the Red Fox of Kinderhook, the swell Dutchman, Martin Van Buren. Unfortunately for the Whigs, although this approach sort of works in that they get 49% of the popular vote, Martin Van Buren is able to carry enough of the votes, especially in his home state of New York, to win the nomination. And so there's four different Whig candidates here. Specifically, the most interesting one to me is the South Carolinian candidate, where, of course, South Carolina, because of their opposition to their states' rights and the policy of nullification, is still refusing to vote Democratic, which is something they'll keep doing here. The Whigs win a number of states, get a decent amount of electoral votes, but Martin Van Buren is still going to become president, and the scheme to throw it into the House of Representatives fails. So the little magician gets to become president, and by all accounts, he was predicted to be a pretty good one. He was a skilled politician. He's an incredibly intelligent guy. He's the architect behind a lot of Jackson's more successful policies, and he's got the entire political patronage machine of the Democratic Party behind him. And so most people expected Martin Van Buren to carry on Jackson's legacy and have a relatively successful presidency. The Whig Party, of course, after losing this election, is going to solidify into a national party. It's clear to them that the whole run regional candidates and try to perpetually throw the election into the House of Representatives is not a good long-term strategy. And so we're going to get a clear divide into these two parties, with the Democrats to some degree picking up the mantle of the Jeffersonian Republicans, and the Whigs being mostly a reincarnation of the Federalists, with some divide over the West, with some Westerners supporting Democrats because of the whole focusing on farmers and low tariffs, and some Westerners moving towards the Whig Party because of their push for internal improvements. They're also going to be continually unified with their opposition to Andrew Jackson. And as we mentioned before, they take their name from the British Whigs, which are the anti-monarchy party in England, basically arguing that Jackson, during his presidency, became an autocrat. So that's the rise of the Whig Party. And our second two-party system is going to be Democrats versus Whigs, which is going to last for a solid, as you can see here, about 14 years, which, not long, but yeah. The Whigs are also going to try to push for push to be the party of urban workers, with the basic argument that we've got these workers as a growing group of the electorate. They can now vote because, of course, we've removed property requirements from most areas. And the Whig policy of protective tariffs supporting manufacturing is going to get workers on their side. And so they're going to try for the first time to be a party of quote unquote working men. And this is going to be an attempt to blunt the influence of the Democrats' appeal to farmers. And so they're trying to build this cross-class coalition with, of course, wealthy businessmen and merchants supporting the Whig Party, and also theoretically workers being on the side of the Whigs. So there'll be some questions as to, one, how successful is this alliance going to be? And two, how big of an electorate is the working men going to actually make up? In the end, Martin Van Buren's presidency is going to be utterly derailed by the economic panic of 1837. This was a pretty clear result of Jackson's bank veto. Jackson's bank veto created a massive speculative bubble in Western lands because the bank money was distributed to all these southern and western states, who then started making somewhat questionable loans, and you started seeing huge amounts of speculation in Western lands. Jackson, at the end of his presidency, tried to pass something called the Specie Circular, which said that buying and selling Western lands could only happen with hard currency, which on the one hand is good because it stopped speculation, but on the other hand, it more or less caused the massive crash in value of Western lands and the huge losses of money for everyone who had bought the land with money that they had gotten from Jackson's pet banks. This collapse in the value of money for pet banks also led to a deflationary spiral, massive business failures, bank failures, and the overall collapse of the economy. So here's Jackson and Van Buren on a Treasury note, with Jackson, of course, in the role of Lady Liberty here, or Columbia, and Martin Van Buren being a literal dragon going to destroy Wall Street with a bunch of demons. So, as far as who they think is to blame for this, Martin Van Buren is going to become Martin Van Ruin to his political enemies. This collapse of the economy is going to have a number of different effects. Obviously, as you can see here, people are going to go to pawn shops in order to sell off their valuable possessions. Here we see runs on banks leading to bank foreclosures. There's people drinking in the streets. The surplus fund balloon is crashing, and Jackson, as the sun shining over all of this, clearly they're saying this is all his fault. So, massive economic collapse, and we'll talk about this next unit as well. It's going to lead to a huge exodus of people heading out all the way west, popularizing this route known as the Oregon Trail. So we'll pick up that thread somewhere next unit. The massive business failures are going to throw tons of people out of work. Here we see a hilarious political cartoon where what used to be a middle-class worker, you can tell that because of his tools, is saying, quote, "I have no money and cannot get any work." And his children are saying, "I'm so hungry. And look, the bank is coming to foreclose on his house." And in the background, Jackson and Martin Van Buren, again re-emphasizing exactly who the anti-Jackson forces are trying to pin this whole crisis on. And admittedly, because it was mostly a result of the bank veto, somewhat fair. We also get the rise of controversies over slavery during this time period, which is going to make this become an increasing issue. We have first the Amistad controversy. The Amistad was a Spanish slave ship in which the enslaved people rose up, killed the Spaniards, and then sailed the ship into Boston Harbor. This led to an immediate controversy about what the heck to do with these enslaved people. The Southerners, of course, arguing that these enslaved people should not be free and you should not encourage slave revolts. Northerners, of course, supporting the rights of these enslaved people. And so there was a trial to try to figure out what should happen to these Amistad mutineers. The Amistad sailors were defended by none other than current member of the House of Representatives and former President John Quincy Adams, who skillfully argued for their release and their freedom. So, the crew of the Amistad was freed, leading to massive outrage across the South because, supporting slave revolts, I guess. John C. Calhoun is going to weigh in even more strongly on the issue of slavery, and so we'll take a minute to pause and allow you to read John C. Calhoun's hardening opinions about this quote-unquote peculiar institution. And so we see a clear shift in tone here from Southerners, moving away from the idea that slavery is a, quote, necessary evil, to John C. Calhoun starting to argue that slavery is a positive good. Ouch. In contrast to this, we also see the rise of abolitionist newspapers, specifically including narratives of enslaved people to try to push back against the Southerners' claims that slavery is somehow a benevolent institution supporting the lives of enslaved people. And so take a moment and read this. And so we start seeing increasing pushback and increasing popularization of the accounts of enslaved people in order to contradict sort of Southern assertions. In order to continue this fight, people like John Quincy Adams keep bringing in letters from enslaved people and letters proposing abolition to be read on the House of Representatives in order to propose bills restricting slavery. This leads Southerners to push back, and Congress, with the encouragement of Van Buren, passes what's called the gag rule, which forbids the reading of any petition related to slavery on the House of Representatives. Because of the way that the House of Representatives operated during this time, reading petitions from constituents or from others was one of the main ways that bills were introduced to the House of Representatives. And so by banning their use and their reading, you're more or less banning any discussion about slavery from the House of Representatives and any bill from being passed about slavery on the House of Representatives. John Quincy Adams is then going to spend the rest of his legislative career fighting against this gag rule and trying to reintroduce issues about slavery to some measure of success, eventually getting the gag rule repealed, but not for a while. So right now, with the support of Van Buren, we're basically going to try to totally ignore the issue of slavery. In the election of 1840, in order to fight against Van Buren, the Whig Party is going to nominate William Henry Harrison, who they now feel, he was one of the candidates from 1836, they now feel has enough national cachet that he might be able to take down Van Buren. The campaign that was run by Harrison was called the Log Cabin Campaign because Martin Van Buren had given a flippant remark about William Henry Harrison being content with a cask of hard cider sitting in front of a log cabin. And so the Whigs seized upon that in order to use it to portray William Henry Harrison as a common man, and the log cabins became a symbol of his candidacy. We also have the awesome campaign song Tippecanoe and Tyler Too, with Whig supporters singing this song and then rolling balls made of a combination of tin and wire in order to emphasize the rolling momentum of Old Tippecanoe, or Old Tip as they called William Henry Harrison, and his vice president, John Tyler. John Tyler was a Democrat who was put on the ticket in order to try to get Southern votes. And so you've got a split ticket with William Henry Harrison, who's sort of ostensibly a Whig, and then John Tyler, a slave-owning Democrat, to try to get votes from all sections of the country. So the Whigs think they have a winning electoral strategy. And by the way, if you've never heard the song Tippecanoe and Tyler Too, you 100% need to Google it. It is absolutely worth your time. To try to push back against this, they attempted to portray Martin Van Buren. So in order to try to emphasize this narrative, the Whigs tried to portray Martin Van Buren as an out-of-touch aristocrat. Here we see this awesome little toy here, where you see Martin Van Buren very happy with a glass of fancy champagne, and very unhappy with a mug of hard cider. Because of course William Henry Harrison likes to drink hard cider just like you like to drink hard cider, whereas Martin Van Buren likes to drink champagne like a fancy out-of-touch aristocrat. We also see the Harrison campaign also constructed log cabins and gave out lots of free hard cider to their supporters, which went a long way amongst Westerners. We see these log cabin rallies where you're portraying William Henry Harrison as a simple Western farmer, which, of course, I mean, he was the wealthy son of a Virginia plantation owner, and as far as I know, had never been near a log cabin before this. But William Henry Harrison, he grew up in a log cabin, probably, just like you did. And so you can go hang out next to this log cabin and drink hard cider, just like William Henry Harrison does. Here we see Martin Van Buren tied down by his horrible economic policies, trying to climb over log cabins and hard cider to get to the White House, which is going to be very difficult for him. And here we see Martin Van Buren trapped by a log cabin while Jackson tries to get him out. Or Martin Van Buren in a circle of log cabins summoning a witch or something. These political cartoons are obviously just amazing. And so your end result is this. William Henry Harrison gets elected. Henry Clay is most likely going to be the shadow force behind his presidency, reestablishing the American system. And the Whigs are victorious with a pretty large electoral coalition in both the North, the West, and also to some extent the South. The popular vote was pretty close, but the electoral vote was a massive sweep for William Henry Harrison and log cabins and hard cider. And so victory for the Whig Party, guys. That's very exciting. Ominously, we see an anti-slavery party showing up. I mean, not ominously for abolition, because obviously slavery is evil, but ominously for the electoral future of the Whig Party, we see a Liberty Party showing up. But at this point, they're only getting about 7,000 votes, so we can probably ignore them and not have to think about them for the future. So let's enjoy Henry Clay's victory for about 30 days, because almost immediately, William Henry Harrison dies. He gives a 3-hour inauguration speech in the cold without a coat. He gets pneumonia and then dies. Meaning that what should have been a glorious victory for Henry Clay instead means that John Tyler, a Democrat who's opposed to all of Henry Clay's policies, ascends to the presidency. He's going to follow in Jackson's footsteps, vetoing basically everything that the Whigs do. We do get a couple things passed over his veto, but not that much. And so in general, Henry Clay's victory is going to turn to ashes in his mouth. And John Tyler is both going to be kicked out of the Whig Party for being a Democrat and vetoing the whole Whig agenda, and kicked out of the Democratic Party for running on a ticket with a Whig. And so he's going to become ostracized and one of the least effective presidents in American history. The one thing that we do get passed is the Preemption Act, which allows people who were already squatting illegally on lands in Iowa and Nebraska to legally purchase them. So that's a small step forward, but it's literally the only thing that we can put on Tyler's presidency. Because Tyler's going to push strongly for the annexation of Texas, which we talked about previously, but he's going to be blocked by Whig forces opposed to bringing in Texas and potentially war with Mexico. So the Texas problem, not solved. The Western land problem in the North, sort of solved. The economic depression, still raging. The other thing that we see during this time period is we see a massive upsurge in immigration from Ireland. We'll spend a little bit more time talking about this next unit, but just keep in mind we're going to see a huge uptick in immigration, especially after the Irish potato famine, which is going to mostly consist of poor Irish people settling in cities of the North. This is different from previous waves of immigration because these Irish people not being able to afford or having connections out west are not going to be able to move west and get land. So as a result, they're going to be, again, tied to the cities of the North. And because they're so concentrated in these areas without that many Irish people, we're going to see some large amounts of anti-Irish racism and race riots in urban cities attacking Irish people, arguing that they're too foreign and cannot possibly be integrated into a good Protestant society, partially because of English prejudices and partially because, again, they're Catholic coming into a predominantly Protestant country. And so we're going to see the rise of nativism during this time period. So that wraps up our objectives here for today and wraps up politics for this unit. Hopefully you're able to answer these questions in some detail, and thank you for listening.